Wonderful turnout. Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Zhao Honghan, Chair of the Department of Arts and Humanities. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the NH Distinguished Speaker Series. The NH Distinguished Speaker Series was set up in fall 2018 to showcase the intellectual diversity, a great and proud asset of the Department of Arts and Humanities. Because of the diversity, the department, with its 10 academic programs, provides unparalleled opportunities to pursue cutting edge scholarship, instruction, and learning. Our speakers in the Distinguished Speaker Series are world renowned scholars in their respective fields of study. Since its inception, we have hosted 2 talks with Professor Judy Burton, Macy Professor of Education, being the inaugural speaker, followed by Professor Janet Miller from English Education. Professor Judy Burton spoke about border crossings, trends, spaces, networks, and new ideas. And Professor Janet Miller spoke about the narrative research, the narrative writer, discomforting reflexivities, and impossible composings. These talks epitomize the scholar's lifelong pursuits and accumulated wisdom. One would think they're all about the past. Wrong. To the contrary, the talks are incredibly forward looking and therefore exciting, as they provide long lasting food for thought. Interesting to me personally, the speakers appear to have exhibited a common trajectory, starting with focused investigation of concrete phenomena to then gradually broadening the scope of inquiry to now being well positioned to speak about and to the field and even across fields, with a commanding view of the breadth and depth of real world complexities. Most noteworthy, again, from my perspective, the scholars now at the helm of their academic careers are more critical than ever, very interestingly, of their own work. And they're now more daring than ever in urging the field to look beyond what it has been preoccupied with. It is the shared scholarly passion and visionary capacity of our speakers that renders the ANH Distinguished Speaker Series a rare, unique learning venue for faculty, students, and practitioners. People interested in listening to the past talks are welcome to check out the ANH Distinguished Speakers webpage. And today, it is with great excitement and a distinct sense of privilege that I open our 3rd talk in the ANH Distinguished Speaker Series and welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor David Hansen, John L. and Sue Ann Weinberg Professor in Historical and Philosophical Foundations of Education. Professor Hansen is going to talk about why the call to teach matters, a fundamental and perennial question that every educator should keep on asking, but a particularly fitting one and timely one for today. We need guidance from philosophers. And the guidance begins tonight with Dr. Cristina Camarano, who will introduce Professor David Hansen. Allora, con mio grandissimo piacere introduco Dottore Cristina Caramano, a mentee of Professor David Hansen and currently an assistant professor of philosophy at Salisbury University. Dr. Camarano's own research concerns conceptions of inquiry in relation to education, the public dimensions of philosophy, and the experience of migrants in multicultural societies. She taught high school philosophy and history for 5 years in Milan before beginning her doctoral studies in philosophy and education at Teachers College. I can't think of anyone else who is more qualified than Dr. Camarano to introduce Professor Hansen for his talk, Why the Call to Teach Matters. Prego.
Hello, good evening, everybody. What an honor to be here. Thank you, Professor Han, for your wonderful introduction in Italian as well. I am here tonight to introduce Professor David Hansen as a speaker. When I asked him, what do you want me to say in your introduction? He said, please, nothing formal. So let me just start with a platitude, but a truthful one. David does not need an introduction. He is a leading philosopher of education who has shaped and keeps shaping our field. You can read about his books and articles and accomplishments. He is the rare case of a philosopher that actually teachers want to read and engage in dialogue with. I have seen practitioners connect with his work in ways that are indeed what everyone working in the field wishes for and rarely achieves. So David will not get a formal introduction this evening. What I thought I would do instead is talk a bit about him as a teacher. In the fall of 2006, at the end of the first week of graduate school, David told me, it's up to you, but you can call me David because we are colleagues. Colleagues, I thought to myself, what can he possibly mean? I am a first-year doctoral student and he's a full professor. I concluded, this must be some American egalitarianism. So I started using a first name basis, taking after the other students in my cohort. My cohort, come to think of it, was wonderful. It was 6 of us coming from South Korea, Argentina, Italy, Puerto Rico, Ohio, and Florida. Just to brag a bit, we are all professors now, teaching at colleges in New York City, in Wisconsin, in Maryland, in Illinois, in Chile, and South Korea. Also, come to think of it, this is a very tangible way that David Hansen and Megan Laverty are shaping our field. But so let me go back to myself. Just landed in America thinking of this professor who thinks we are colleagues. What could that possibly mean? Over the years, I have come to see that one way to interpret this invitation was as such. We are colleagues because I am a teacher and you're preparing to be a teacher. I am a scholar and you're preparing to be a scholar. Okay, I thought to myself, this makes sense. Americans are optimistic and future-oriented, so they see preparing to be something like being that something. My old, jaded self instead knew very well that between preparing and becoming, there is a difference that can be insurmountable like an abyss, especially in academia, an environment which tends to showcase and indeed magnify social hierarchies. With time, I came to see that David indeed meant we are both always preparing. He taught me with patience how to be a scholar. David has always time for his students. While he was on sabbatical leave, he invited me and 2 others to co-author an article with him. Yes, during his sabbatical. Now, co-authoring something with David is not necessarily a painless process. It did require many rewrites and meetings and rewrites. During his leave, he gave us this incredible gift of teaching us something by doing it together. And as a side note, this would make John Dewey very happy, right? I still remember the clear pangs of joy coming from completing the weekly readings for his class, an accomplishment so rare, given the quality and the quantity of assigned pages, and so precious. Most Sundays, he would send out these emails saying, I know you must be well underway with your readings for Thursday, but I wanted to point out some passages, questions, themes for your reflection. David was teaching us to be teachers with every small action, every email, every extra meeting he offered to us, his students. Another way that I could make sense of his invitation, we are colleagues, became manifest to me over the years as I defended the dissertation, survived the job market, became a professor myself, and continued to collaborate and learn from David. Now we are indeed colleagues, even though the magnitudes of our positions do not compare in any possible way. Still, the main way that we stay colleagues is because we are studying together. Here, would say David, come, be part of this project that involves 2 years of collaborations across disciplines with teacher educators. It also involves 10 drafts of a joint manuscript and a special issue and 2 conferences. And why? This, of course, has to be completely new research and scholarship. What do you say? And also, have you read anything exciting lately? Would say David. I am learning this new language so that I can learn this author in her original tongue. This is this other way in which his invitation is true is that we are colleagues because we are both students. Professor David Hansen is a student of the human condition. He studies it with attention, with love, with labor. He studies teaching because teaching, he often says, is like dancing, is like making art, is like finding beauty. It is a human endeavor which makes us really more human. Tonight, he is going to talk with us about why the call to teach matters. We are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming David Hansen.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me back in the back row? Okay, far away. Okay, great. There's a lovely image associated with philosophy, one that goes back millennia, and that I always find myself remembering on occasions like this. It can be summarized as follows: to think is to thank. Thank for what? Well, for the gift of thought itself, the gift of being in this world of ours that calls out our thought, and the gift of human connectedness that thought itself helps make possible. So I'd like to thank at the beginning of these remarks for the gift of this opportunity to do some thinking with all of you. The chair of our department, Xiaowang Han, for initiating this distinguished lecture series. I also want to tip my hat to the previous speakers, my dear colleagues Judy and Janet. Those of you who heard them speak last fall will know they set a very high bar. Thanks a lot, Judy and Janet. I also want to honor my colleagues in the Department of Arts and Humanities, many of whom I've had some great conversations and collaborations with over these years. And then last but not least, I also want to acknowledge the gift of thought of students in our program here in philosophy and education, and many of them are here this evening. I want to thank them for their marvelous commitment to inquiry and to a meaningful education for all people. And no longer a student, but now a graduate of our program and a professor at Salisbury University, I want to thank Christina for making the trip up from Maryland to be here this evening. And I appreciate those gracious words a great deal, and I'll try to mirror them back if I can in the remarks to come. So the title of the lecture is Why the Call to Teach Matters. And what I propose to do is to think through the terms in this title with you. Along the way, I may not be saying anything that you don't already know, even if I may be using an idiom of teaching that may be unfamiliar to you. But the knowledge that I'm going to be talking about, call it a kind of moral knowledge, all too easily slips away and gets forgotten, sometimes to our peril. So let me begin at the top with the interrogative why. And here there's a handout that some of you, I think, found. I don't know if there's any extras around, but if you don't have one, don't worry. I'll be able to highlight the key terms that I'm going to be touching on. So in education, as we know, most questions begin with what and how. What are the problems we're facing, and what solutions can we come up with to address them? How should we approach and work with others engaged in confronting these problems? It's very natural that most educational questions should be of the what and how variety, since so much of education is action-oriented in the most direct sense of those terms. Think of any teacher who comes to mind from preschool through university, trying to determine what to do and how best to organize their classroom and their pedagogy. But as I've learned in the course of my career, and as I know many of you have learned as well, countless teachers also appreciate the interrogative why, even if it is posed less often. I've worked with literally hundreds of dedicated teachers and teacher candidates in my time. Going back to my work before graduate school as a teacher, and also with a nonprofit organization in which I worked with dozens and dozens of groups of public school teachers on how to infuse into their work what we might call a kind of Socratic method. And also going back to my first university appointment way back in the 1990s at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I served as director for a decade of the College of Education's secondary teacher education program, in the course of which I got to know a great many teacher candidates and cooperating teachers in public schools in virtually every corner of that wonderful city by the lake. Parallel to these endeavors was a research program that I got underway at that time, which has continued through today, having to do with trying to come to grips with the questions, what is teaching, with an accent on that verb is, and what does it mean to be a teacher? Again, an emphasis on the verb here, to be. My first two research undertakings, one of which I began as a doctoral student and the other as an assistant professor, were both a fusion of philosophical inquiry and field-based inquiry. The one had to do with the moral dimensions of teaching, and here the concept moral served as a term of art for trying to see and make sense of the sometimes profound and empowering influence that a given teacher can have on children or youth. And this notion of teacher influence remains for me a fascinating and remarkably complex notion. In this 3-year-long study looking at the moral dimensions of teaching, which was undertaken in several Chicago schools, I devoted over 400 hours to bearing witness in person to a group of 9 middle and secondary school teachers as they went about their everyday work in their respective classrooms and schools. I also spoke with each of them many, many times, most of these spontaneous and on-site, but others in a series of formal one-on-one interviews about their own sense of the moral aspects of the work they're doing. The other undertaking, initiated when I was then an assistant professor, had to do with this idea of teaching as a calling, an idea that, as I discovered in the course of continuing to interact with these same teachers, seemed to do justice to their passion as teachers. By passion here, I don't mean raw emotion or feeling. I mean the forms of suffering, using that term in an ancient sense of having to undergo. The forms of suffering that each of these teachers experiences, given that teaching in urban public schools, if not schools everywhere, is often marked by compromise, by half-realized hopes, and by failure. Since the rise of standardized testing and other forms of top-down, one-sided accountability in our area, much of which, it seems to me, reflects a deep mistrust or distrust of teachers, the suffering of dedicated public school teachers has taken on new forms because of having to struggle now more than ever to keep alive, which is to say to keep in action their fundamental moral commitments to students, and as I'll touch on in a moment, to the practice of teaching itself, which these teachers see as threatened by contemporary pressures to reduce their work into a narrow mode of prefigured social engineering. In this regard, let me say right up front where I'm going in this lecture, that where I'm going in this lecture is where I think many good teachers themselves seem to go. Namely, to the conclusion that teaching is not an engineering or technical project. It's not primarily a matter of problem solving, even though problem solving is a continuous element in it. Put in a quite different and perhaps surprising way, teaching is not fundamentally a reflective practice. The reflection is an essential constituent of the practice. Rather, teaching, it seems to me, is at heart an ethical endeavor, a dynamic, ideally ascending movement of teacher, student, subject matter, and world. Teaching means being with students and the particular subject at hand in a concernful, in an engaged, and what I would like to say, ontological manner. With that term, ontology, we're calling the core verb in the questions. What is teaching? And what does it mean to be a teacher? As I'll try to illuminate here, I think it's misleading to assume that teachers are applying a theory of teaching in their face-to-face work with students. Rather, they are, I think, participating in a long-standing, significant human undertaking to which we've given the name teaching, which derives from an Old English term, tekon, which means to show, to illuminate, or to guide. Metaphorically speaking, when teachers walk through the classroom door, they meet the terms of this practice that they've now entered, and they come to a reckoning with them in highly singular, distinctive, and hopefully interactive ways. Or they may leave the ranks of teaching rather quickly, as we know some people do. My apologies for if my voice gets a little rusty. I was just in the state of New Mexico, in Santa Fe, which is 7,000 feet. That does a real number on your voice and your breathing. So now that I'm slowly coming back down to sea level, so bear with me. The passion of dedicated teachers, as I mentioned, there's multiple kinds of suffering that seems to go into that passion, but it also encompasses their deepest aspirations and yearnings as teachers. However unspoken these aspirations may be and these yearnings may be, indeed, however out of reach of language they may be, to achieve a meaningful life for the students and for themselves. The idea of the call to teach helps us recognize, I think, the eros of dedicated teachers, echoing here that ancient Greek term, the ancient Greek meaning of eros, as denoting, among other things, a deep longing for belonging. And again, there's that verb to be, belonging or a longing to be, which is to say to truly realize and bring to life one's potential fullness as a human being in conjunction with supporting others to do the same. And by passion, I also mean the forms of joy that each of these teachers experiences, the other side of their suffering, if you will, since their teaching lives are also marked by moments of intense and unforgettable fulfillment as they contribute visibly to the well-being of particular students, or as they make a breakthrough with a struggling colleague, and with their advice, that colleague makes a good turn in their pedagogy, or as they craft a rewarding and enduring relationship with a caregiver, a parent or guardian. And let's also not forget the laughter. There's a quite distinctive kind of laughter, it seems to me, that a teacher and students share together that differs, I think, from the laughter between friends or colleagues. The teachers I came to know in these two long-term endeavors on the moral dimensions of teaching and on the call to teach, as well as some of the many cooperating teachers that I met as a field-based teacher educator, were often deeply gripped by why questions, as well as deeply inspired by them. Why am I teaching what I'm teaching? Why do I believe interacting with students in this particular way is so vital? Why is it important for me to appreciate my students' life contexts and to communicate well with others who play a role in their lives? At the end of the day, why am I doing this work rather than any other? From this perspective, the title of this presentation is a variant on the questions, why teach at all? And why is teaching such a potentially significant contribution to the lives of human beings? So I've composed a book on each of these two endeavors, one that's called Exploring the Moral Heart of Teaching, and the other, The Call to Teach. This latter book features portraits of several of the teachers that I got to know well from spending such extended time with them. They themselves, according to their own wide-ranging testimony, resonate with the language of calling, even though they did not initiate its use in our communications. Indeed, to this day, I can't recall any of the teachers that I worked with ever saying in so many words, I'm called to teach, or I have a calling. For that matter, I'm hard-pressed at this moment to think of any teachers I've known in my life, from preschool through university, who have said such a thing in my hearing, although I imagine it must have happened. But then I also can't remember ever hearing a teacher say, I am a moral teacher, or I am an ethical teacher, or even, although I must have heard this from time to time, I am a good teacher. Now, clearly, there's a very familiar modesty at work here on the part of dedicated teachers. There's also an understandable feeling that the language of a calling can sound rather pie in the sky, perhaps reserved only for those heroes and heroines who blaze a trail towards goodness and justice. And as I hope to show, that's actually a misunderstanding of the call to teach, what the call denotes. But I discern here more than natural modesty at play, indeed something much more than that. Consider the well-known phrase that perhaps like you, I've heard many times. I'm drawn to teaching because, paralleled by the equally commonplace question, what draws you to teaching? I can think of any number of conversations where colleagues here at TC and I have used these very terms in talking about our own practice as teachers. What draws us to it? Why are we drawn by it? On one level, this vivid experience of being drawn by or drawn to refers to motivation. It's a response to the why questions about teaching that I touched on previously. We know from research and from extensive, eloquent personal testimony from teachers at all levels of the system that these motivations are quite varied, ranging from a desire to work closely and systematically with children or with youth or with adults, or a deep connection with a particular subject, whether art or math or science, or an aspiration to advance justice and fundamental human well-being with regards to a particular community or to society writ large. And there are endless variations on all of these responses to the questions of why teach, as well as why keep teaching, even in the face of numerous obstacles and challenges. For example, scholars such as Joseph Epstein and Teachers College's own Anna Newman have illuminated the strong sense of calling that marks the teaching of some faculty at the university and college level across quite different subjects. As another example, Vanessa Siddell Walker, Michelle Foster, Grace Stanford, Gloria Ladson Billings, and others have illuminated the rich sense of calling that animates some African American teachers across the K-12 spectrum. Teachers who seem deeply fueled by a sense of what Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot nicely calls giving forward to the community, while engaging their students in a formative academic educational experience. Research and testimony has spelled out a comparable sense of calling that guides some Latinx and indigenous teachers as well. In a broad sense, this sense of vocation, this sense of being called, runs side by side with that of many teachers, whether white or black or Latinx or Asian, who enact what you might think of as or what we might call a kind of steady form of dedication to students and to academics, who, put a different way, bring to life for us the familiar triangle of teacher, student, and subject matter, and who do so with a consciousness which may be more felt than articulated of the human significance of this endeavor. One of my very own best teachers, whose name was Mrs. Rudsky, who was my English teacher in 10th grade, had absolutely zero patience with my colleagues and me if we didn't put forward our best effort. I can't say I liked her very much at the time, but she taught me to write, and she taught me what poetry is. Again, accent on that verb to be. I also learned, because of her wholesale engagement with teaching, I also learned how to respect the very idea of education and to begin to develop a relationship with my own education, although I couldn't have put these things in words, those words at the time. And indeed, I think it's taken my whole career to get close to being able to put into words what happened with Mrs. Rudsky. What I'd like to underscore here is that there's a felt notion in the call to teach of something larger than oneself, something to which a person is willing to give themselves over to, or at least some substantial, meaningful portion of themselves. And I mean this in a more than solely metaphorical sense. To be drawn in a compelling way to teaching is not to choose it, as if shopping in some kind of career marketplace. Rather, it's to be chosen. The person hears or discerns, so to speak, a call or a summons. Something about teaching takes on a magnetic quality. Draw near, teaching seems to say to the person. Come here, look here, be here. Importantly, for many a teacher candidate, and for many an established teacher, at least in my experience, the realization of what is drawing them may take time to come to life, both in words and in deeds. Teacher candidates may be able to say quite intelligent things about teaching from the word go, in part perhaps because they're expected to. But such language may at the same time feel to them somewhat distant or abstract or unmoored. The call to teach, in short, is often inchoate and inarticulate, and potentially so for quite some time for a teacher. It can be hard to discern what it is inside teaching that is compelling one to invest in it, to stay with it, to keep giving it a go day after day after day, even in the face of countless challenges. Indeed, we know that some persons more or less simply stumble into teaching because they can't think of what else to do, only to awaken in some cases to the realization that at the end of the day, it wasn't mere coincidence that they took this stumble rather than another. In short, it's rarely instantaneous that a person comes into awareness of their deepest eros for a life of public service, which is what teaching is, and a life of personal fulfillment, which is what teaching can be. Recently, I completed another long-term undertaking that fused philosophical and field-based inquiry, inspired in part by what I experienced during the other two long-term endeavors that I've mentioned, having to do with the moral dimensions of teaching and the call to teach. This recent study was also inspired by a decade's worth of research on the idea of cosmopolitanism as an orientation toward how to inhabit the world justly, in the course of which I did a lot of writing on how this orientation, in my view, can be of service to today's teachers, whether they teach in multicultural or homogeneous settings. What I recently undertook was to devote 2 years to working with a group of 16 New York City public school teachers from quite varied backgrounds and schools, and yet all with a reputation for being dedicated to the work. Thanks to funding from a number of sources, including our own TC, we were able to meet 21 times over the course of the undertaking for 3-hour-long evening meetings, where first we would break bread together and then plunged into open-ended discussion in response to the core questions that gave rise to the study. And the core questions were, what does it mean to be a person in the world? And what does it mean to be a person in the role of teacher, especially in light of our tumultuous political, social, and cultural times? And note again, parenthetically, the presence of the verb to be in those core questions. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be a person in the role of teacher? Our discussions on each of these 21 occasions over our 2 years were spirited, engaging, confusing, contentious, dispiriting, inspiring, and more. Perhaps not surprising, since we were addressing bedrock issues of who and what we take ourselves to be and to be doing as teachers. I also devoted over 200 hours to bearing witness to their work in their respective classrooms, and undertook a series of recorded individual interviews, all of which constituted an extremely rich experience that gave rise to the terms that I've used a couple of times already in this presentation, which is to say, what it means to bear witness to teaching and to teachers, or put a different way, what it means to bear witness to the call to teach. Although I don't have time to address this term here, what it points to is inquiry, whose aim is not knowledge production per se, as in trying to add to our knowledge base of teaching, which I think is better left to subject matter researchers and to teachers themselves. Rather, the aim of witnessing is attaining ethical proximity with teachers, with ethics here signaling not codes of conduct per se, but rather modes of solidarity, modes of relationality, modes of understanding. I sought quite literally to be in teachers' company, which means to be as responsive and as attuned and as fine a listener as possible. And then also not just to keep them company, but to accompany them as they go about their work and try to realize their educational purposes. This proximity allows, in turn, I discovered, the possibility of bearing witness to the truth or to the reality of teaching as itself an ethical endeavor. One of our recurring themes over the course of our 2-year-long conversation, or sometimes debate, or sometimes dialogue, or sometimes contretemps, is many things. One of our themes over the 2-year-long period was the question of when and how a person first feels like a teacher. First feels, in other words, that they're on the inside of the practice, so to speak, rather than still searching for a relationship with it. One of the teachers, a 10-year veteran, of middle school teaching, put it this way. Sorry, bear with me. And I'm quoting here. I thought it'd be a lot easier, the teaching, but I've been disabused again and again of the idea that teaching is easy. I was definitely a little bit egotistical and arrogant entering my first teaching job, thinking, I'm a smart guy, I can do this. But the development of the teaching craft and teaching instincts, I was not a good teacher until working at this school, where he was entering his third year after working 7 previous years in another public school. I feel like I've just continued to grow. I read the idea, oh, you can get a good teacher with a lot of support in 1 year. But if you think about good as having to do with a person developing into his or her capabilities and capacities, then you absolutely don't get a good teacher that quickly. End of quote. I think we can push the envelope even further to say that the call to teach never receives any kind of final answer or response from the teacher who hears it, any more than a dedicated teacher can or would ever say to her or himself, I am a final human being, or I'm a final teacher, with nothing further to learn. As a doctoral student whose dissertation on the existential realities of teaching I recently read put it, and who had been teaching primary school for 7 years, quote, for me, to be a teacher is not an achievement, but an ongoing commitment to a radical questioning about what is good and desirable, with the radical hope of embracing something deeply good that is not yet known to me and may never be. End of quote. Another way to render what I'm getting at here with regards to teaching is that it can take time to develop a relation with what is drawing the person to it, what is calling the person to it. When I was director of secondary teacher education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, what my colleagues and I looked for in our admissions process was not people with some kind of fully worked out sense of a calling. We were not on the lookout for heroes or heroines fired by missionary zeal. And the idea of a calling, as I've mentioned, can sometimes be misconstrued, and I think problematically so, as implying some kind of heroic posture. In my experience, it is extremely important to dedicated, thoughtful teachers to speak of their work in the richest, most idealistic, most beautiful terms possible, because these teachers sense what we all know, that descriptions of what we do matter, because we live and we act under the descriptions that we use. But these same teachers then turn around and remind us that the actual enactment of the call to teach is typically quite prosaic, as is much of teaching itself. Albeit, and this is what I'm going to say now is as vital as anything that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening, albeit in the sense that the seemingly most ordinary of experiences and moments in the classroom can be vehicles of profound and enduring insight. It may be the look on a student's face, the tone in a student's voice as they express an idea, or a gesture that one student makes to another. These fleeting moments, which are so rarely noticed by classroom visitors, may feel like breathtaking revelations of humanity to teachers themselves, and are often what keep them passionate about their work over the years. So what my colleagues and I hoped to see in candidates was not a hero complex, but rather someone who expresses signs of being able to build an ethical relation with teaching. And again, I don't mean ethical in the familiar sense of a code of conduct. I mean the term in its much more primordial sense, reaching back literally millennia in the philosophical literature, of ethics as conjuring the ethos of a person, in which the teacher, her or himself as a person, is in question, even as they're forming themselves as teachers. The questions that loom here include, who am I to be a teacher? What qualifies or warrants my taking on this responsibility, this important responsibility, to educate other people's children, to echo a title from a very important book by Lisa Delpit. Who must I become if I'm to build a simultaneous educational relation with students, with the subject I'm teaching, and with myself as a human being, taking on this significant aesthetic, moral, and intellectual practice? These are questions that seem to me accompany being called to teach. They remind us of how intensely personal, indeed person-forming, can be the work to someone who gives themselves over to it. They're why in recent years, philosophers of education in my field have been arguing how valuable for teachers are what Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault and others have called ethical self-cultivation, or the ethical care of the self, which these authors are very careful to distinguish from the so-called neoliberal self or entrepreneurial self. These scholars reach back to ancient practices in the Mediterranean basin, in China, South Asia, and elsewhere, and in so doing illuminate what it can mean to fashion what I'm calling here an ethical relation with the practice of teaching. Through various arts of judicious reading on the part of the teacher, of careful self-reflective writing, of somewhat unfashionable today, but nevertheless significant activities like memorizing poems or songs and other significant formulations of deep values and deep meanings, the teacher can cultivate, often without even knowing it, cultivate continuously the capacity to retain a sense of direction, even in the face of sometimes daunting circumstances. The more I reflect on what the teachers and I discussed together in the 2-year-long person project, as we came to call it, the clearer it becomes to me that the teachers are themselves engaged in ethical, which is to say formative exercises or practices of the self, albeit not in so many words. One of the teachers, for instance, who's an 8-year veteran of high school English here in the city, routinely begins every morning when he comes to school by first arranging his classroom and then sitting quietly as he reads a few pages in one of Fyodor Dostoevsky's majestic novels. When I asked him why he undertook this daily ritual, which I'd noticed during my visits, he replied that it reminds him vividly, just before he's about to encounter his students, of their many-sided humanity and of his own, so that they can ideally be together, emphasis on the verb, they can ideally be together in the classroom as persons rather than as merely occupants of roles. This teacher's habit may sound unusual, the reference to Dostoevsky, but so many of the so-called routine aspects of teaching can become practices of self-cultivation, if not in so many words, whether it's modes of greeting students when one sees them the first part of the day, or whether it's the tone and tenor of classroom exchanges with students, or whether it's the thought that can go into giving feedback on work. All such doings can slowly constitute, or again, form the person in the role of teacher. And all of this is why teaching for the teacher can be a continuous discovery of who and what they're becoming. Importantly, ethical self-cultivation, conjoined with building an animated relation with the practice of teaching, is not an individualistic undertaking, even though its movement depends on the singular teacher's openness and initiative. All of the teachers I've worked with attested to the value of another ancient ethical practice of the self, namely continuous focused dialogue with peers. The teachers spoke of how vital it is to their very well-being as teachers to have trusted and trusting colleagues with whom to discuss their most authentic concerns and hopes, with whom to keep what I've called their fundamental eros as teachers alive and well. The term we sometimes see in the literature for this is teacher solidarity. I don't mean this in the overt political sense of the term, although mobilized teacher action can be invaluable, as we've seen of late. Rather, I'm thinking of how Ruth Heilbron at the University College London, how she reminds us that the roots of the term solidarity point to notions of standing with others, or being solid with others, or binding one's being with others. She shows how the term solidarity has close family relations with the term comrade, whose original meaning is one who shares the same room, which in turn overlaps with the word camarade that appears in several languages, including Italian, meaning authentic, trusted friend. Well, what is this solidarity rooted in? What is this solidarity rooted in, to which the teachers I've worked with are pointing? I think it goes back to the inaugural meaning of the term, to share the same room. Regardless of what age level or subject they teach, it seems to me that dedicated teachers everywhere share pedagogical space. They share in the practice of teaching. They may differ markedly in their motivations to teach, in the specifics of what they do, in the theoretical and instrumental resources they may draw upon, and so forth. But it seems to me there's an underlying reality, call it a sense of unity without uniformity, of being members of a long-standing practice on this planet of ours, whose roots go back well before the founding of schools and universities as we know them. So let me bring these remarks to a conclusion. The call to teach matters, I think, because it points vividly to how the life of a teacher can be fulfilling even while being of real service to other human beings. The call to teach matters because it emanates from or is rooted in the practice of teaching itself, which is to say it has social rather than purely psychological origins. We can characterize the terms of this practice in diverse ways, something dramatically visible in the long history of philosophical reflection on teaching around the world, as well as in the wide landscape of writing and testimony about the work in our time. Based on my own career-long study, including the scholarly endeavors that I've touched on this evening, it seems to me that the terms of the work mirror the idea that teaching constitutes an ethical practice. Or put another way, that ethics is the fundamental condition of and for teaching. Again, not in a narrow sense of a code of conduct or of morality, but in the primary sense of the ethos of our humanity as teachers and as students, as we engage one another with the experiences we bring to the table, and crucially, as we engage the larger world, the world that is much bigger and more enduring than any of us, embodied in part in those long-standing realms of inquiry and of meaning that teachers are called upon to care for, ranging from art to music to mathematics to literature and more. The practice of teaching is always already there when the teacher walks through the classroom door, and as I mentioned before, when the person meets its terms, metaphorically speaking, and comes to a reckoning with them. These terms are often best understood not as particular methods or as activities, but as questions that accompany the work, moment by moment and day by day and week by week. Can I, as a teacher, attune myself aesthetically, morally, and intellectually to students? Can I respond to their often unspoken, yet ever-present address to me to be attentive? Can I bring a vivid sense of wonder to bear about who and what and how they are as human beings, with wonder understood as antithetical to imposing or projecting preset categories on them? Can I bring a like sense of wonder to the subject I'm teaching so that it comes alive and meets the lives of students? Can I enact a sense of concern for teaching as a practice when I'm called upon as a practitioner to vindicate it or to defend it or to advocate for it? Can I see myself as a person who's going to help make it possible for other teachers to come after me and thereby preserve this crucial human undertaking? Can I picture my work, in other words, as a many-sided mode of giving forward? The call to teach matters, including to those of us involved in one way or another in teacher education or research on teaching, because we should do all we can, in my view, in the spirit of solidarity, to support teachers, including ourselves as teachers, in meeting the terms of the practice meaningfully as we cultivate and develop an ethical relation with it, with the work itself. The political ramifications that accompany teaching as a calling shine forth here. To sustain, in what we might call an environmentalist sense of sustaining or conserving, the practice of teaching itself in all its dynamic, ever-changing fullness, against those forces that would, if you will, melt it into air. Those forces are all too real in our time, but then so is the call to teach. I'm going to stop here and just thank you for listening as I thought out loud with you this evening. Thank you very much. That wasn't as long as I thought it was going to be. So happily, we have some time for discussion. And let me pull a teacher move and suggest that we take maybe 1 or 2 minutes of just silence. I put forward a lot of ideas here, and just take a few minutes to contemplate any issue or idea you'd like to comment on or pose a question on, and then we'll go from there. So why don't we go ahead and open up, and maybe let me suggest that we take maybe 2 or 3 questions in a row or comments, and then I'll sort of see what I can do with them.
I want to thank you by thinking with you along the lines of this really interesting turn and return to thinking about the ethical self of teaching, because it seems like part of what you are doing is saying that the ontological practice that we're undertaking in teaching is not an ontology that asks the question, what is a human being, but instead, what am I? And I want to think specifically about 2 really interesting phrasings that you used regarding teaching. Early on in the talk, you used the question, why am I teaching? And you had a really interesting pause. I don't know if it's your throat coming back from New Mexico, but you said, why am I? And then you paused for a significant amount of time and then said teaching. And later in the talk, you asked the question, who am I to teach? And it's funny because if you take, usually we would ask the question, why do I teach, right? And if you ask the question in terms of a doing, in terms of a practice, it can be answered in terms of money, it can be answered in terms of knowledge, it can be answered in terms of social status, lots of things. But if you take the teaching out of either one of those questions, you end up with, why am I and who am I? And I wonder if in any of the empirical studies that you've done, if you've seen any of these teachers, if any of their erotic drive is fulfilled by teaching as an investigation of how we become who we are as human beings, because it remains a question for most of us throughout our lives. And we can't get back to the point where we were formed, but we can get back to the place by becoming the teacher who forms somebody else. So I'm wondering if there's anything in what you've heard in your empirical studies that has anything to say about that kind of satisfaction for teachers in understanding how it is being used.
I'm not sure if everybody heard the question on the far side. Did it come through? I said it would take 2 or 3, but I'm just going to go with this one because it's actually so many-sided. Why am I and who am I? I have, James, in the incredible good fortune I've had to spend so much time as a witness in these classrooms and schools. I have seen teachers and students, your language is just right. I've seen teachers and students go back to the place of beginning. You can't rehearse it, you can't go over it again, you can't shift it or change it. We have become persons of a certain kind. But I've seen them in different subjects really get back to sort of grounding questions, as you're mentioning. I've seen moments in classrooms where no one knew quite what to do, but they were really glad to be there. I could give you narratives, but it would take another lecture to do well. But in other words, this notion of eros, this notion of a teacher wanting to engage students in a way that they really realize something about their humanity, they bring it into form, they bring it into presence. That does happen. One last thing I would say, it takes a lot of patience and return visits to put myself in a position to see something like that. And one of the reasons that all 3 of these projects I mentioned were long term was like stuff I've touched on this evening, just shared with James. I could never have seen the first couple of weeks or months, even the first year. It takes a little cycle of the circuit. There's so much more to say, but I really like that notion of teaching, being the students of getting back to beginnings, primordial beginnings, and being able to really start again. That's some interesting things. Yes, over here, please.
So my question is about cosmopolitanism in education and sort of the changing tide around what constitutes as cosmopolitanism and sort of notion of reaffirming white supremacy through cosmopolitanism. And so I'm thinking along the lines of sort of a Confano show in cosmopolitanism for Asian American students versus sort of cosmopolitanism from a Sharon Todd perspective around gender and feminist inquiry. And I'm wondering, sort of kind of like, what is the new take of cosmopolitanism? So you wrote about the triggers of cosmopolitanism triggering sort of this negligence in social identities and social norms and traditions in 2010. Yet a lot of authors and scholars since then have started to shift their notions around cosmopolitanism in education. Have you in your work started to think about the shifts and how it reproduces notions of white supremacy in schools and or white ideologies? And or is it sort of, are you still sort of doubling down on the position that while it does trigger these negligence and traditions, there's still this notion of an awareness of a broader construct?
It's challenging when you have your own work quoted to you. Thank you for reading that earlier work. And very, very briefly, because it's a big issue. Cosmopolitanism is what W.B. Galley, in a very famous article in the 1950s, called an essentially contested concept. There's tremendous debate in the area that we can call cosmopolitan studies about what that term points to. For me, it points to this. It points to how we can learn from everyday people, everyday communities, so-called everyday people, people going around, people going about their daily affairs in contexts where they're interacting with people who are different. We can learn from those situations, which have been increasingly shared in the research literature on cosmopolitanism from the ground up, that's rooted in people's local particular kinds of lives and traditions. That, for me, the word cosmopolitanism points to how any person in any community can cultivate a kind of reflective openness to those who are different, to new ideas, values, practices, all of the above. But at the same time, a reflective loyalty to their own roots, their own origins, their own trajectories, their own communities. So that in itself, there's much more to say. I think is a profound challenge to any kind of supremacy. White supremacy, gender supremacy, age supremacy, class supremacy, you name it. Precisely because it's not a top-down formulation. It's being imposed on people. The work I've done on it, and this is why I so enjoy doing this work with cosmopolitanism, is it's something that's coming from the ground up. It's not waiting for authorization from top-down authorities or powers. And one last quick comment. This cosmopolitanism from the ground up, one of the exciting things about it for me is that it holds the promise of creating a kind of soil, using that metaphor, in which institutions of human rights and the like can take root. All too often, these lovely institutions that we create for human rights, they don't endure. They don't last very long. Why is that? Because we haven't cultivated this soil. That would be a brief response. Thank you for the question. And keep reading, you know. I'm doing new stuff on cosmopolitanism. Other questions?
Professor Hansen, I was intrigued by the fact that you were going to talk about the call for teaching. Because I'd love to know how many people here actually had a call to teaching before they were taught.
That's a question.
That you knew you wanted, that you felt that. I come from a Baptist preacher family, and the call was always for preachers, you know, and the Lord did that sort of thing. But I had one cousin who became a preacher who said to me, well, sometimes the Lord calls by opening and closing doors, and it gave me a whole new thought about that. But also, I went to a teacher meeting one of my first years of organization, of convention. And it was so wonderful. And this is where I think your concept of morality, not morality, you call it ethics, comes in. But I was just overwhelmed by the support and the fact that some people had more trouble than I did and worse situations than I did. And the fact that we could share and gain from that and in that community was the most important thing that kept me in teaching. If it was that, it was one part of the call, and I never got to identified it as that, and the other was the light in somebody's eyes who got it, a child who got it. And what, like you said, you don't forget, but they're the little jewels you carry. I guess I'm talking more than I'm asking.
But thank you for the comment. And if I can just comment in reply, one thing I touched on here is that in my experience, this call to teach, some do feel it, to use your words, very early on. But most of the teachers I've worked with who if you will, enact a sense of calling, it comes with the work. You may have a kind of sense of it, there's something that's drawing you to the work, but to put it into kind of a form, much less to enact it, that's really time intensive and experience intensive. And that's why I would say I don't think a sense of calling should be a requirement for entering a teacher education program. That would be a very defeated way of thinking. Rather, I think as teacher educators, we can help new candidates begin to think about the process of why. So, thanks for your comment. Please.
I'm interested in your discussion of ethical proximity and how it is related in most lectures that I attend. A lot of people think that they need to talk about intersectionality, or this is intersection here or there. It's kind of like a constant theme. You presented a situation in a school where the teacher opened up with Tuskegee, and you ended your presentation with calling us all together to reflect on content, to bring forth any comment that we may have. And it was all inclusive, and it brought me back to your ethical proximity. Can you share a little more about what you meant?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Ethical, the first word, ethical, is the notion of ethos that I touched on in my remarks. The ethos that we have, that we bring to bear in our interactions. The ethos of a classroom, the ethos of a teacher-student relationship. Proximity, that's a really interesting word. We start really getting into it and open it up and look at different parts. Proximate is a physical relation, literally close. But proximate also means, you think of approximate. Proximate also means we're not sort of prejudging, we're not sort of prefiguring, we're always approximating. We're trying to make sense of who we're with and what we're saying and what we're doing. But ethical proximity is just, it's very bound up with the notion of bearing witness that I touched on very briefly in the talk as well. The whole idea of witnessing, teaching, and teachers that work with their students. Witnessing is an ethical orientation, much more than, if you will, an epistemic orientation. It has to do with, and this is the notion of ethical proximity, it has to do with how over time, someone like me who's spending time with teachers and students, how can I learn to continuously bracket my own expectations or my own prejudgments and become what poets call, and I don't mean to be sort of pretentious and not pretending to be a poet, but they have some very good things to say. Becoming what poets call receptive.
Mm-hmm.
Receptive. Mm-hmm. Or what poets call becoming a receptacle. Or what poets call getting to a point where you're transcribing what you're seeing, not describing it. You're transcribing it. Mm-hmm. You are just a conduit. Mm-hmm. You're just a vehicle. That's the ideal of bearing witness. I don't claim to have gotten there. I can think of some authors who have. I can think of some poets who have. But that's, I don't know if that's helpful to you. That's this whole notion of ethical proximity. It's a beautiful, rich concept. And if I can say one other thing, based on your question. If I was Secretary of Education, and also Secretary of Defense, Secretary of many other cabinet that's in this country. I would take all that money, and I would support the education of a vast cadre of experienced teachers to become witnesses in schools, so that every single teacher in this land from K through 24 had a witness to their work. Someone who's not judging, someone who's not there to advise, someone who's not there to correct, someone who's not bringing a deficit perspective, et cetera, et cetera. But someone who is there to help that teacher call out her best. Pie in the sky. Utopia and capital U visions. But it isn't actually so utopian. There's people doing this in schools. They're called teacher mentors. They're called teacher educators. There's people who really know how to do this really well. Big speech, sorry. Other comments? And then 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, David. You mentioned toward the beginning of your talk that teaching is not fundamentally reflective, although reflection is a vital component of the work. Now, not all teachers are fortunate enough to work with you and have these organized meetings in which creating a space in which to reflect. So I imagine that you would strongly advocate for creating this space in which to reflect, in which to share. But I wonder, to what extent do you think that teachers should explicitly, or perhaps implicitly, model the creation of that reflective space for their students?
Nice. Yeah, the claim I made early in the presentation that it's not, the teaching is not fundamentally a reflective practice, not in terms of the face-to-face with the students. I wanted to stress that because I do feel, and I touched on this in a number of ways, that when teachers face-to-face, the words are not reflection, but attunement, receptivity, sensitivity, listening, opening oneself up. There's a whole vocabulary there that has to do with being present to students. Reflection is a key constituent, I think, before and after the fact, an essential constituent for the teacher at any level before and after the fact. But if I'm reflecting in the moment with students, I'm not attending to them. There is another kind of thinking going on, and we don't have time to get into this. There's definitely another kind of thinking going on. As I listen to a student and try to make sense of what he's saying, I am sort of thinking with, but it's not a reflective kind of, it's not a distant way of standing back. It's very unique. That's sort of one point. The other point is very well taken that all of us who teach, in a sense, have a privileged opportunity, you might say, to help students, whatever their backgrounds and age level, to have experiences of reflective talk and reflective inquiry, where we are keeping a bit of distance from the subject at hand. We're thinking about it, we're thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about how we're talking to each other, thinking about whether we're listening to each other. So I think that's a lovely thing. But again, as long as we can keep stuff on the difference. So there is this kind of face-to-face work, and then there are moments when we can model or explicitly engage in sort of reflective work. The other thing I would say that you touched on briefly, it was unusual, and the teachers I worked with in this 2-year-long person project said it many times, very unusual to have an opportunity to work with teachers, not from their own school, but from other schools, on something as primordial as what does it mean to be a person in the role of a teacher. To a person, they attested in many different registers, in many different ways of how much they enjoyed that, but also at times how much it unsettled them, and how challenging and difficult it was, really thinking about what the heck are we doing face-to-face with our students. We all sort of thought it would be a lovely thing, again, if we can take all that money that's being misused to create these kind of opportunities for we have a question over here. Please, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking to the calm and the passion that it takes to truly teach. Speaking to also the idea that you mentioned, though, some people didn't necessarily feel a certain call, but they fell back on it as a job to do because they didn't think of anything else to do. That idea right there just kind of stunned me because I know so many people out there who are going into classrooms with no training, going into classrooms as if it's just something to fill in the time, and they're messing up a lot of our babies. They're contributing to the problem rather than the solution, even though it's presented as a so-called solution to more education, just to get more people in the classroom, if you will. So what do you oh, there's so much in my head, Lord. What do you propose we do to change this? Because it seems like, of all that we're speaking of right now, as somebody who feels like I was definitely called, even at age 5, to be a teacher and has lived my life as an educator in so many ways, it is disheartening. It's insulting to hear those who go into classrooms with that mindset that this was some fallback thing I'm just going to do real quick and just spend some time here just to kill time even, when they're killing the imaginations of our children in that meantime. So in order to cultivate this understanding of the ethos, of the reflection that is required, like you said, before and after, and even just to understand all these beautiful nuances and ways to capture the imagination of our children and to pour into them rather than messing them up as much as we do. How do we change that narrative around it? Outside of this room, of course. How do we change that narrative that, oh yeah, you can just go in there, just get some people who they have a degree in anything and just put them in a room with some kids and let them, monitor a little bit, but still hold the rest of us accountable to fixing the problems as they're created at the same time that we're trying to fix them.
One thing we can do is talk in exactly the way you've been talking everywhere we go. In every setting that we find ourselves in. When teaching is at issue, when teaching is being discussed, to speak in this register that you just shared with us. That this is something so deeply important that we can't take it for granted. It's not a casual kind of work. I think just trying to, wherever we go as educators, to talk in this way. It's kind of developing a habit of vindicating teaching, supporting teaching. But the other thing we can do is remember, as painful as it is, and disheartening, and I would add the word outrageous, to see teachers who are just, they're not teachers. They're occupants of the role. It's extremely frustrating. And in all the schools that I touched on in this evening's lecture, I witnessed teachers who were, I wouldn't want my children in there or anybody's children in there. It's really rough to hear their kind of interactions. But we have to approach them, I think, through the lens of witnessing. Can't just blow these people off, to use a colloquialism. Got to approach them the way we would approach students who are really struggling with being students. Got to approach them the way we work with any of the people that we interact with as educators. In other words, we decry deficit approaches to children. We know how long-term those have been. But we can't turn around and have a deficit approach to teachers. As bad as, let's just be blunt, as bad as some of them are. We've got to find a way to move towards them. We have to have a certain proximity. All these years have been done, and I know there's people in this room, because I've seen some of their faces, who are working on this very much in the trenches. We have to respect the dignity of every person. That's got to be a ground. And then we may find fresh, creative ways to talk to that person who sees it as 9 to 5 and say, just why live your life that way? Come on and watch this other teacher and see what can happen. And we can go on and on very creatively. But I want to come back around to what you said. We must talk this way publicly as much as we can, as often as we can.
Okay, so we have time for one more,
I think,
one last question.
Actually, we have can I do one thing, Joe? We have a habit in our own program in philosophy and education where we have colloquium. At the very end, when there's about 2 minutes to go, we say, if you have a question, let's hear it, but the speaker cannot answer. So let me do that right now. I'd love to hear your question, and if there's any others as well. Please.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the notion of what you talked about when you said inadequacy, like who am I to teach? And the feeling that calling, I'm a pastor of a church, and as someone who has preached many sermons, I know that the best sermon are the sermons that actually instruct, uplift, encourage. You know, I fought it for a long time because this notion that I was not up to this thing, and that what are you doing bothering me about this, and this call that I couldn't actually get away from. I guess I stumbled into it more than I really wanted to. But this notion of teaching is so absolutely essential to not just discovering who it is that you are, but how you fit in the world in which you live. So I'm wrestling with this notion of who am I, you know, who am I to teach, this thing that you talked about with regard to this call, this notion of what Heschel talks about in the prophets of being this on fire individual that most of the people just kind of like look at and saying, why are you bothered? Why are you bothering? How all this stuff is kind of, it finds its way into the heart and soul of people who really want to do something about the community in which they live and feel a real urging. It's like a itch that you can't quite scratch. And I just, you know, I'm rambling now, but I want you to kind of, if there's anything you can do with any of what it is that I've just been saying, I think great.
Thank you, but I've silenced myself for now. Is there another hand I saw over here? Or are we done? Yes, sir.
Excuse me. I appreciated your definition for ethics as sort of modes of solidarity, and you spoke about solidarity as having one sort of existence or being entwined with another's, and that made me think of allyship. I would be curious to hear your definition, or I'm sort of struggling myself to reconcile allyship as I see something being more like activism or activist, in reconciling what you described as being a teacher as being a conduit and being a witness. Those to me seem in conflict, and sort of like on a micro scale in a classroom, when as a teacher to make choices to go one way or the other was a question that I'm leaving here with.
Oh, I wish I hadn't silenced myself. One more here, and then we'll stop.
I was really struck by what you said about that you've never heard in your hearing a teacher say, I had a call to teach, or I'm answering a call to teach. And I recently asked a teacher if he would agree with me that his teaching is characterized by respect for the dignity of his students, to which he responded that he doesn't think of it in those terms, because if he said it, then it wouldn't really be there. If he had to say it in words, he wouldn't really be doing it. And that made me think, what is the relationship between being, which you talked about so much, and saying or describing, or between responding to a call and articulating that response, or maybe between teaching and bearing witness to teachers. And so what is the value of this bearing witness, and who does it have value for?
Thank you all for wonderful questions, and we have a reception now. Thank you very much.